G'day everyone, continuing on with our big questions. And today I have Jenny Ducker, the Pastoral Relations Minister for Sydney Presbytery. Hello, Jenny.
Hello, lovely to see you. And
fantastic. Lovely that you could be here. Jenny's actually working from South Australia. I'm in deep envy. She's able to get haircuts, everything like that at this point in time. She escaped before we all got locked in. So congratulations, by the way, for that. Now, Jenny, I have pulled you in for probably, I think, the trickiest of the big questions, to be honest. And I want to apologise right from the start, but I've given you a challenging one. Here's the question, everyone. It is this. I'll read the whole question out and we'll then shorten it down. I'd like to get an understanding of gender for a Christian perspective. My stepdaughter has revealed that she is non-binary and or gender fluid, and it's hard to make sense of it from a biblical perspective. I know that God is both male and female and that we are made in his image. So perhaps non-binary is the same. I don't know, but I'd love some guidance. Gender from a Christian perspective and that whole question of non-binary and stuff, it's a tricky one, isn't it?
Just a little.
Yeah.
Firstly, don't apologise for the big question. I think it's an amazing big question. And I'm just really excited that people are exploring it and willing to engage with hopefully open minds, even if their opinions don't change through the conversation. At least hearing perspectives can be helpful in building relationships.
Yeah, and to be brave enough to actually ask a question like this in our church context, I'm really impressed. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Where would we start with trying to explore it?
I think I would always start from a position of God is grace. And I start from that position because I think we have a lot of voices in our society, and especially in the church, saying that there is a right answer and there's a wrong answer. Now, there are right answers from any kind of perspective we want to take, but we get bombarded with messages of there is a right answer, and if you don't agree with my right answer, then clearly you're not Christian enough or faithful enough or whatever enough. So I start from that position of God is grace, and God can hold all our perspectives together.
Yeah, God might know the right answer, but it doesn't mean that our muddling around the edges of it actually is the right answer in the process.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in a sense, as we go into this conversation, we should hold that tension of God's grace and God's love as a foundation in the conversation.
Absolutely. And even if you don't agree with me and I don't agree with you and we don't agree with anyone else, God is still gracious enough to hold us all together in it.
Yeah. What does the scriptures play when it comes to that concept of gender and that kind of stuff? Is there much in the scriptures about gender at all?
I think you could probably argue both, yes and no. I think if we look at Genesis, we're told God created people, humans in God's image, male and female, God created them. So we can take our foundation from that there is male and there's female. But I would also put the caveat on that those passages are written from a human perspective, even when they're God-inspired. And the human understanding at the time was very much there are male and there are female. And yet we know now that, to put it really out there, there's more than that, because there are those who are born with both genders. Sexual organs.
There's actually, it's not overly common, but it's very clear, isn't it, that there are people born with both male and female organs as a part of birth, and they have to actually choose which way to go.
Yes, or they don't choose, and they live with that tension constantly in themselves of they are neither male nor female, and they're both male and female.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine how difficult that is for them to live with. But that's not quite the conversation that we're having today.
True, but it does ask the question about when we enter a conversation with, say, someone in that position or someone else, that a foundation of God loves you and God values you and God sees your humanness as important is really still an important foundation. We wouldn't want to take someone out of the love of God accidentally there, would we? Like, you know, by our ignorance.
No. And I know that it has happened for at least some people in that position. I have heard stories where they have been told that they are the devil's child because they have both male and female organs, where their whole identity has been wrapped around, I've been abandoned because I don't fit with what my parents wanted me to be.
One of the things that the church should constantly confess and plead for forgiveness from is the arrogance of calling someone the devil's child for historically any reason.
Yes.
How dare we ever suggest that we know God's voice to that extent?
Yes.
There's an arrogance in that that's horrific.
Mm.
Yeah. I'm sorry, my little bit outburst there.
I can say preach it, brother.
Yeah. So the question of non-binary in a modern day world is sort of saying, I don't want to identify as either male or female, isn't it really, in a contemporary context, saying I don't want to call myself a man or I don't want to call myself a woman.
Although what you're saying there is that it's somebody's choice. And it might be somebody's choice to say, I don't want to. I think there are also others for whom it's not a choice. They simply don't identify as one gender or another.
Yeah. For the people that have been watching these little series and looking at my sermons on Sunday, my sermon was looking at around the idea of the predestination stuff and actually saying that, yes, there are the chosen people of God, and that is us all. We're all chosen by God. And in a sense, I think this conversation doesn't take away that chosen by God. Even a person sort of struggling with that gender identity stuff, you're still loved and chosen by God. God still calls you.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Occurred to me that probably the most helpful question I have ever asked somebody in that kind of a position where they're discerning around their sexuality, whatever their sexuality might be, has been, help me understand. To sit with somebody and ask them that is to saying right up front, you're a human being. I love and respect you enough to want to understand what you're going through, what you're experiencing, what's going on in your mind. Help me understand, because that broadens my perspective as well, but it also enables me to offer something of the grace and love of God into that conversation.
So that's a really good question, isn't it? Help me understand, because it actually allows us to explore that question of God's grace in the midst.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also taking away any assumptions I might have of, I know exactly what's going on for you in this.
Yes. Or me trying to correct you or change you.
Yes.
But listen, I need to listen to you first. I love the part of this question that sort of says, I know that God is both male and female, and that we are made in his image. So perhaps non-binary is the same. It's sort of asking that thing of, I did smile when I first read the question, because it sort of says God is male and female and we're made in his image, because we automatically go to naming God the his. But I get what they're saying, and I really like that exploration of, like, we can't pin God as a bloke or pin God as a woman. We just pin God as God.
Yes.
Is that the same with our humanness, or does our humanness attach to our gender?
I think our humanness is attached to our gender only because over history we have made it so. I don't think that our humanness is necessarily attached to our gender. And if we look at Paul, and please forgive me, I am not really good at a chapter and verse and book of the Bible, but Paul talks about there's neither male nor female, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. So there's our humanness in that God perspective is not attached to gender. It's attached to our personhood. It's attached to our relationships with God and with one another.
So in the heart of this question, it's trying to make perspective. It's sort of trying to grapple with it from a biblical point of view. Part of it would be that the biblical point of view wouldn't grapple with this that much, would it really? From the authorship at the time.
I don't think so. Partly because I don't think they recognised it as an issue or a concern. Society most likely wouldn't have endured such a question. But if I focus on the New Testament writings is more about love and God's love of all people. It was this great explosion of suddenly God's not restricted just to the Jews. God's inclusion is everyone. So I think that when we grapple it from that biblical perspective, it's how do we show the inclusion of God, which isn't necessarily to accept that which is wrong. And this is where we get ourselves, I'll speak personally, this is where I get myself all tied up in knots. Because for me, I cannot say that somebody who has a different sense of gender identity to myself is wrong. I think it's around the whole God. If God includes, who am I to exclude? And for me, the New Testament scriptures are around God including more than God ever excludes.
So sort of the questioner is really asking this of how do I, so I'm glancing off to the side because I'm looking at the question from time to time. The questioner is really sort of saying, how do I grapple with this big issue of gender fluidity, of non-binary, and how do I tease that open? And in a sense, what I'm hearing in the conversation we're having is, don't try and pin down, here's the right or the wrong answer. God might know that, but we're struggling with it. Yeah. But the answer is, how about you listen to that person that's struggling with those issues, and how about you try and care for them with the grace that God has? Mm. Would that be a reasonable summary of some of what we're going down?
Absolutely. I think if any of us can do that, then by whatever God does in us and through us, we're actually building God's kingdom.
Yes. Because Paul's scriptures are always, like the way that Paul writes is always an interesting one to go back to, because like he basically is constantly lobbying for the early church that started out of a Jewish group to be open to the Gentiles, and some of them are going, well, they're not Gentiles, they're not really that chosen, how can you accept them? And he's constantly going, part of God's family, let's not try and exclude them. Is that sort of a similar kind of thing here of, let's not exclude, but let's try and listen and share a God of love in the midst of this?
Yeah. If we go down the line of exclusion simply because we don't understand or because it doesn't fit with our comfort, we're making we're making God's family very, very narrow.
Yeah.
And God constantly teaches us that God is bigger than that.
Yep. There is always more light and truth.
That's right. And I don't have to agree with everyone, and I can't agree with everyone, whatever their theology is or lack of theology, whatever their identity is. I can't agree with everyone, but that doesn't mean I exclude them.
Yeah. Are there any other things that you would want to explore with this question that it's good that we don't know who the person is that's put it up. Is there any more that you would want to explore in this question, Jenny? Have you looked at it and my expert that's thought about it so I can springboard off you?
I think I would want to affirm the questioner by saying that parenting is really hard. Whether they're your biological children, your in-law children, or stepchildren, parenting is really hard. And accepting our children when they make choices or have a life pattern that is different to what we would choose for them, it's really hard to step back enough to allow them to be their own identity when you can have such great visions for what they can be and how they can live their life. But we don't actually get to choose that for them beyond perhaps the early years of their existence.
Yes, yeah. Of course, I want my children to be perfect because I could never achieve perfection. So, at least someone can.
Absolutely. And I have to say my children are perfect.
Yeah, I can believe that.
Perfectly different to whatever I would have imagined for them.
Look, thank you. Is there any more that you would want us to play with in this question? If not,
I'd only bring it back to the grace that as you grapple with this in your family. So again, this is probably directed more to the questioner than to everyone else. As you grapple with this in your family, just rest in God's grace and allow God's grace to guide you in the conversations.
But I think we all will bump into, if not this question, other questions that might be similar in life, isn't it? Like we get things that are out of our perspective and out of our understanding from time to time.
Yeah. And
I suppose to have that, a foundation of let's enter this thought with grace and an openness to explore God's voice in the middle of this.
Yeah.
Rather than going in with a predetermined conclusion, it's important.
It is important. Yeah.
Jenny, I want to deeply thank you for coming on this.
Look, I've appreciated the stretch of my mind and my heart in the question. It hasn't been easy, but it's been enjoyable in its own way.